Olympic athletes were celebrated in the House of Commons today as Team Canada was on Parliament Hill to be recognized for their performance in France this past summer. While the political Team Canada seems to be falling apart less than a day after the Prime Minister called his political rivals together.
There is a tradition in Canada that when times are tough, when there's a moment of crisis, or when we're threatened, Canadians pull together. We step up, we go across partisan lines, and we defend Canada. It seems increasingly clear that that is not something Pierre Poilievre is able to do.
Prime Minister Trudeau is taking aim at the Conservative leader, who yesterday said publicly that the border was broken, even though Trudeau and other party leaders say that just plays into Donald Trump's hands. But Poilievre is the leader of the opposition. His job is to hold the government to account. So where is that line between legitimate criticism of government policies and playing into Trump's hand? That's where we start with the Power Panel. Amanda Alvaro is a former Liberal Party communication strategist. Tim Powers is a former strategist for Conservative parties. And here with me in studio, Jordan Leiknitz is a former NDP strategist, and Sherelle Evelyn is the managing editor of the Hill Times. Sherelle, it was interesting. Yesterday, the leaders all got together. The Prime Minister said, don't go out and talk down the border. It helps Trump. Poilievre came out and did that. Today, he did not. But you saw what Justin Trudeau had to say by criticizing Poilievre for something he didn't do today. Where do you think this is going in terms of getting some kind of alignment at the federal level here?
I don't know if we'll actually get it. I mean, obviously, there's no law in the books that says, you know, when somebody's mean to Canada, everybody has to drop swords and link arms and, you know, kumbaya. That's not how it has to go. Yes, there can be some nuance in there. Yes, there can be room for legitimate criticism. Like, you know, obviously the leader of the opposition is not all of a sudden going to say, hey, you know what? Everything that I said before, forget it, because we want to make sure that, you know, Donald Trump is nice to us. But it is, I think, a tough balance to find. And I don't know if we'll, given the state of the relationship, the state of the environment, the political scene, I don't think we're ever going to get to where we really want to be. It was really enlightening to hear someone like Yves-François Blanchet, the leader of the Bloc Québécois, say that, you know what, behind closed doors, everybody was a little bit more reasonable, more cordial. If we all were able to talk like that all of the time, we would be a heck of a lot more productive in this country. But that's not something that people have any real will to do. Right. So we're going to get more of the same. It's
a crazy notion that your public behavior should match your private behavior, but here we are
Wild.
In 2024. But Jordan, you know, Steve Verhoeven, who's a behind-the-scenes guy, but was a very prominent trade negotiator in Canada and worked on, you know, the NAFTA renegotiation. He wrote a piece in the Globe this week saying you can't have different messages coming out of Canada because it just makes it all that much harder when you sit down with the Trump administration. So how do you balance the partisan interests of all the people who are going to run in this election in the next year with, you know, this time-limited crisis you have to deal with Donald Trump before January 20th?
Sure, and I think the point is a valid one. I would maybe quibble. I think you can have different messages and different messengers, but I think it does need to be coordinated. There needs to be some sense that this is part of a broader plan and that people are not having one message at the expense of another Canadian leader, right?
Right. And so Trump is right, for example, would be a message that
would not
is a
be
problem,
a winning,
right?
yeah,
Yes.
I would say. And look, I think this is a moment of political danger for Pierre Poilievre in some ways, because you can see that there is a temptation to go out and to underline some of those issues, like the border, where he may think that there's a failure on the part of this government, you know, and gets very annoyed, of course, when he's reminded that it's a previous Conservative government that cut CBSA agents and all of that. But he may see some potential there for him politically. But there's a risk that if he digs too deeply into that, he can be seen as undermining Canada's interests in these negotiations by reinforcing some of Trump's worst assumptions about Canada. And also, frankly, on the part of Canadians, who I don't think anyone's under any illusion are necessarily voting on competence on this issue. But you have to look like you want the Canadian government to do well in this. You have to look like you're on the side of the Canadian government succeeding in these negotiations. And so for him, the risk is in overreaching and looking a bit like he might actually not be too unhappy that Trump is raising those criticisms. And I think what you're seeing here is the awkwardness of him figuring out where that line is for him.
Tim, how do you see it?
Just building off something Jordan said there, I think Pierre Poilievre knows his political history pretty well, David. And he will remember when Stephen Harper was the leader of the opposition and the Iraq War came about. Mr. Harper got it wrong related to the Canadian move. Of course, Mr. Chrétien opposed the war. Mr. Harper said he would support George W. Bush at that time. He had to live with that for years. And at certain points, it hurt some of his electoral chances. I think first and foremost, Pierre Poilievre is reminded of that, not wanting to fit into that box. I think to Cherelle's point, he's not going to just stop being partisan all of a sudden. So you're going to have little jabs here and little jabs there. I would be extremely surprised, though, if he went right outside the box and somehow found himself fully allied with Donald Trump. In fact, he's offering a slightly different counter narrative to the prime minister's, which is we need to be a bit tougher, we need to be firmer, and he's echoing a little bit of Trump and saying, if you had done this before, maybe you wouldn't have these problems. So it's a new space for him. He knows what happens if an opposition leader gets it wrong. He's been trying it out this week.
But Tim, just on that, there's a gap between we need to tighten things up and the border is broken, right? Like there is a gulf of difference between those two positions.
There's never been a gulf of difference between the flourish of rhetoric that Pierre Poilievre brings forward, David.
Right.
And I don't think that's all of us. I don't think, to the point of nuance, you're suddenly going to get a nuanced argument from Poilievre around that. He's going to throw some things out there. He'll let it get corrected. And yes, your point's absolutely valid. What is a 0.01% of fentanyl that crosses into the U.S. comes from Canada, based on the numbers from last year. I don't think he's worried about being precise there.
No, fair. But, Amanda, I wonder if the goal is to bring everyone together, the Prime Minister stomping on his way into question period today to take a shot at Poilievre and say he just can't put it aside to get on Team Canada. Is that a good move 24 hours after pulling them together? Should he have let it play out a little bit more to see if Poilievre might reconsider? Because this is like waving a red flag in front of a bull when the Prime Minister does something like this, isn't it?
But at the same time, you also know that if you don't call it out, that Poilievre's temptation, as Jordan put forward, is to go as hard and as aggressive as possible. Like, that's his instinct. He has the attack dog instinct, and that's where he goes. And for the Prime Minister to use the opportunity to say, wait a second, Canadians expect not just from government, from Parliament, they expect us to be operating in national interest, not in our personal interest, not in a self-interest, certainly not in a partisan interest, especially around times of crisis. And I think that if Poilievre is seen to be sabotaging any of these efforts, he runs it's dangerous for two reasons. One, because it'll weaken our position at the negotiating table, which runs the risk of actually negatively affecting our economy, as we've all been talking about. Right. But I agree with Jordan that he's running a personal risk as well, a reputation risk. Mm-hmm. Like he's been riding this wave of slogans and sound bites, and that's his instinct. His instinct is to go there. But I don't think Canadians are going to look favorably at this time to see somebody who has said that they want to run this country as the same person who's prepared to put his self-interest first. So I think he's playing a pretty dangerous game, not just, a broad game, which can actually affect our economy and our negotiating power, but also a game that could affect him in the polls.
Right, so Cheryl, go ahead.
Can I just pick up on a point Amanda made? Because I think she made a very important point, and that is the assumption we all make, and I make it too. I think the team approach is better. I think Team Canada, we're all in it together, is right. I think Poilievre, though, maybe he's sensing something in the broader community that maybe the way things have been done, because that's the approach he's taken with every other policy, is not going to be the way they are currently viewed by Canadians. So let's be careful to suggest that what's worked for 50 years, which I fully support and would like to see working together, rules-based order, team approach, is what works now. So he's been usually right on tapping into a sentiment of, worked for a while, but now is not the case. So let's be careful.
Well, look, you may be completely right on that. And Cheryl, like disruption and a change of style and a change in approach, that's a big part of the Conservative appeal to voters. And that's an argument for the election. There's 47 days until Donald Trump becomes the 47th president of the United States. And that's the timeline to avoid these tariffs, right? So there's no time to disrupt the approach in the time that is available.
Yeah, no, and I agree with Tim that if you're looking for that longer time frame, if you're looking towards, okay, well, what are people going to care about in October, then yeah, Pierre Poilievre might be on the right track in saying his whole message, his whole narrative is, I want the Prime Minister to look weak. So me agreeing with him is not going to help that situation. But if you're looking at the shorter timeline of what's going to happen in January and whether or not, there should be some sort of win garnered before then, sure, maybe it's not going to help. I mean, there was if you look at thinking about domestic policies and criticism of domestic policies, those are always going to be wins for Pierre Poilievre, no matter what time it is. And I think that's where his brain is going. And there is a lack of, I think, engagement with the American issue that we've seen from him. He hasn't gone down to the States like his predecessors have, like Andrew Scheer did, like Erin O'Toole did, like Justin Trudeau did when he was the leader of the third party, like Brian Mulroney did before he became Prime Minister. So he came out of that meeting on Tuesday and said, well, it should be obvious and easy to make these arguments to the Americans that these tariffs are going to hurt them. Is it going to be that obvious? Isn't it going to be that easy? Because I'm pretty sure we've been around this horn before.
There are a lot of people who supported Donald Trump, and Donald Trump himself will think the tariffs will be good for America, right? That it'll actually raise buying power and lower costs and bring production home. And by the way, I think it's great that you're optimistic the election won't be until October. But there you go. But Jordan,
Wishful thinking.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it is 47 days, right? That is the window that's there, and I just wonder how you think this plays out politically, because it is the politics of the country are so different from Trump 1. There's an election coming. The current government's in a lot of trouble. The most influential person in terms of driving public opinion right now is Pierre Poilievre.
That's right.
So what he does matters here. So how do you see it all playing out? Because I think the other parties are kind of going to back the Prime Minister until then. Yeah,
and I mean, I think you've seen a different model of how to do that opposition while supporting the Team Canada approach from Jagmeet Singh. So he's been critical of Prime Minister Trudeau, saying that he wants to see more urgency. But he's brought forward some specific ideas, the idea of a jobs war room, of preparing the case under Kuzma, and all of these things. And so I think there are ways to do it differently. I think we're going to see Poilievre continue to find his feet on what opposing the Prime Minister looks like while not undermining the Canadian case with the Americans. I think ultimately it's in his interest to find something that's a better balance there. And, to what Sherelle was saying, this is so much about the Prime Minister's weakness. It's about his weakness domestically, and it's about the perception of his weakness from Trump and the people around him. And so what Poilievre has to really watch is not celebrating that weakness, not trying to leverage that weakness externally, because that's where the danger is for him politically. So I think we're going to continue to see him fighting against clearly what his instinct is, which is to attack and to push and to use these slogans and to be really reductionist in what the answers are here. And, he will be pressed as well, and I think rightly should be pressed. If he's going to be Prime Minister, we need to know what he's going to do. What would he do in that situation beyond the slogans, right? So I think we're going to see that play out over the next few months.
Amanda, just the last 30 seconds to you, though. If the Prime Minister is as weak as Mr. Poilievre says, then he will have a very clear proof point of that on the 20th of January if the tariffs go up and this effort was unsuccessful, right? So is it better for him to be seen to be offside with Team Canada, as the Prime Minister defines it, or onside and then see what the result will be when a month or so from now?
Well, I think it's best for him to look like the adult in the room, which he does right now, and Minister Freeland does as well, to make thoughtful statements about what's at risk and what's at stake and how we're going to bring the country together in order to get the best negotiating position possible. The issue of partisanship, it's like, listen, you have to know the difference when it's a good time to play partisan politics, and we've seen a year of it, really, like the most partisan politics I think we've ever seen of last year. Poilievre has milked it dry. But you have to know the difference when to play the political partisan games and when to act like the statesman, when to act like somebody who actually wants the job of running the country.